You're sitting in the dark. Around you, strangers settle into their seats. The rustle of popcorn bags. The hum of the projector warming up. The comfortable, familiar smell of a movie theater. For most people, going to the movies is one of life's simplest pleasures. A few hours of escape. A chance to forget the world outside and lose yourself in someone else's story. But sometimes, the horror doesn't stay on the screen. Welcome back to The Scary Collector. Tonight, we are going somewhere most of you have been dozens of times. Somewhere you've taken your children. Somewhere you've sat on first dates. Somewhere you've laughed, cried, and eaten too much popcorn. Tonight, we are going to the movie theater, and we are not leaving the same. These are 8 true, deeply disturbing stories submitted by real people. Witnesses, victims, and survivors of incidents that happened inside movie theaters across the country and around the world. Some of these stories involve crimes. Some involve unexplained phenomena. Some involve the kind of human behavior that no amount of therapy will ever fully help you process. All of them are real. All of them happened in a place just like the one you visited 100 times before. Turn off your lights. Get comfortable. And whatever you do, don't look at the seat next to you. This is 8 true disturbing movie theater horror stories. Our first story comes from a woman named Renata. She submitted this account through our channel, and she asked that we use only her first name. She lives in the American Midwest, and this incident occurred in the autumn of 2019, just a few weeks before Halloween. She was 27 years old at the time, a graduate student working on her thesis, and in desperate need of a break. She decided to treat herself to a solo movie night, something she had always enjoyed. There was a thriller playing at the local multiplex that she'd been wanting to see, and on a Tuesday evening in October, she bought herself a ticket, a medium popcorn, and settled into her assigned seat, seat G8. Row G. The theater was almost completely empty. It was a weeknight showing of a film that had been out for several weeks, the kind of screening where you might be the only person in the room, which Renata actually preferred. She liked the solitude. She liked having the whole space to herself, but she was not alone. In seat G7, directly to her left, sat a man. Renata noticed him before the lights dimmed. He was middle-aged, she estimated. Somewhere between 50 and 65. He wore a dark coat that looked too heavy for the mild October evening. His hands were folded in his lap. He wasn't eating anything. He wasn't on his phone. He was simply sitting there, perfectly still. Renata told herself she was being paranoid. People sit in assigned seats. The man had a right to be there. She turned her attention to the pre-show advertisements on screen and tried to relax. The lights dimmed. The movie began. For the first 20 minutes, everything was fine. Renata got absorbed in the film. She munched her popcorn. She almost forgot the man was there. And then, she heard something, a sound, low, barely audible beneath the movie's soundtrack. At first she thought it was the theater's ventilation system, or maybe someone in a row behind her. But slowly, very slowly, she realized the sound was coming from immediately to her left. From seat G7, the man was whispering. Renata held her breath and listened. She could not make out words, not at first. The film's audio was too loud for that. But the rhythm of the whisper was unmistakable. It had a cadence, almost like prayer, or like someone reciting something from memory, over and over and over again. She stole a glance at him from the corner of her eye. He hadn't moved. His hands were still folded in his lap. His eyes, she could see this even in the darkness, were open and fixed on the screen. But his lips were moving, rapidly, continuously, whispering that sound she could not quite decode into words. Renata shifted in her seat. She told herself again that this was nothing. Maybe the man had some kind of condition. Maybe he was repeating the dialogue from the film. Maybe she was just on edge because it was October and she'd been watching too many scary movies. She turned back to the film. Then the man turned his head, not toward the screen, toward her. Renata felt it before she saw it. That particular sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of your neck. The sudden certainty that someone's gaze has locked onto you. She turned slowly, and he was looking directly at her, not glancing, not accidentally making eye contact, staring, and he was still whispering. She could hear it clearly now, in the brief quiet moment between scenes. Just 2 words, repeated again and again and again in the same flat, hollow tone. Stay still, stay still. Stay still. Stay still. Renata did not stay still. She grabbed her bag, got up, and walked as calmly as she could to the end of the row. She found an usher in the hallway and reported what had happened. 2 staff members went in to check. They found seat G7 empty. The man was gone. The theater had only one exit from that particular screening room, and neither Renata nor the staff had seen anyone leave. They checked the restrooms. They checked the lobby. They checked the parking lot on the security cameras. Nothing. There was no record of anyone purchasing a ticket for seat G7 that evening. In fact, according to the digital ticketing system, that seat had been locked, flagged as unavailable due to a broken armrest that hadn't yet been repaired. No one should have been sitting there at all. Renata drove home with every light in her car on. She told us she has not attended a solo movie screening since. And she says that on certain quiet nights, usually in autumn, usually when she's alone, she still hears it, that hollow, even whisper, stay still, stay still, stay still. She has no explanation. Neither do we. The following account was submitted by a man named Derek. He is a former employee of a movie theater chain that operated across several southern states in the early 2000s. Derek worked as a projectionist for nearly 6 years, and during that time he witnessed things that, in his own words, turned a job I loved into one I had to run away from. He gave us permission to use his full first name and to share the details of what happened to him in the summer of 2003. Derek was 24 years old and working the closing shift on a Friday night. The theater he worked at was a large, older building, one of those grand multiplex theaters from the 1970s that had been converted and expanded several times over the decades. It had 12 screens. Narrow projection booths ran along the back of each auditorium, connected by a long corridor that stretched the entire length of the building. Derek's job at the end of each night was to shut down every projector sequentially, working his way from booth 1 to booth 12. It was a routine he'd performed hundreds of times. Walk the corridor, enter each booth, power down the equipment, move on. Simple, methodical, familiar. On this particular Friday, he was the last staff member in the building. The manager had left early due to a family emergency, and the other employees had clocked out after cleaning. Derek didn't mind. He liked the quiet. He liked the feeling of the building all to himself after a long night of crowds and noise. He started at booth 1 and worked his way down the corridor. Booths 1 through 7. Nothing unusual. He powered down each projector, checked the reels, made his notes. The corridor between booths was lit by dim fluorescent strips that buzzed faintly. They always had, and Derek had long since stopped noticing the sound. He entered booth 8. He stopped. Projector 8 was already off. Derek stood there for a moment, confused. He was certain he hadn't powered it down yet. He'd been going in order, and he never skipped screens. He checked the logbook he carried. Screen 8 was not checked, but the projector was definitely off. The equipment was cold, not just switched off, cold, as if it had been off for hours. He shrugged it off. Equipment malfunctions weren't unusual in an old building. He made a note, moved on. Booth 9. Off as well. Booth 10. Also off. Derek was now feeling deeply uneasy. 3 projectors in a row, already cold, already dark, in a building where he was supposedly the last person. He stood in the corridor between booths 10 and 11 and pulled out his phone to call the manager. No answer. He tried the assistant manager. No answer. He stood in that buzzing fluorescent corridor and tried to think rationally. That was when he heard the film. Not from any of the booths he'd already checked. From booth 12. The last one. The one at the very end of the corridor. The sound of a film playing. Derek could hear it through the projection booth wall. The muffled audio of a movie, voices and music and sound effects bleeding through the insulation. But that was impossible. There had been no late night showing on Screen 12 that evening. He knew the schedule. Screen 12 had been dark since 9 o'clock, and yet he walked to the end of the corridor. He stood in front of the door to booth 12. He could hear it clearly now, not just audio, but the distinct mechanical whirring of a projector running. He opened the door. The projector was running, but the booth was empty. No reels loaded. The gate was open and the light was shining through. Not projecting an image, just a raw beam of white light cutting through the small window into the auditorium below. Derek leaned to the projection window and looked down into Screen 12. The auditorium was supposed to be empty. It was not empty. There were people in the seats. He could see them clearly in the light from the projection beam. Silhouettes in the darkness, seated in the rows below. He counted quickly. 12, maybe more, sitting perfectly still, facing the screen. Facing a screen that was showing nothing but a blank white light. Derek did not go down there. He backed out of booth 12, walked, and then ran down the corridor through the lobby, out the front doors, and sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could make himself dial 911. Police arrived within 8 minutes. They swept the entire building. Every auditorium was empty. Screen 12 was dark. The projector in booth 12 was off. And cold. The officers found no signs of forced entry. No signs that anyone had been in the building other than Derek. The security camera footage from that evening showed nothing. No patrons, no intruders, no movement in the lobby or the corridors after the last employee besides Derek had clocked out. The footage from the camera covering the entrance to Screen 12's auditorium showed only the closed door. Still, unmoving, no one entering, no one leaving. Derek submitted his resignation the following Monday. He has not worked in a movie theater since, and he told us that to this day, he cannot sit in the front rows of any cinema, because he cannot stop himself from imagining what it looked like from above. All those silhouettes, sitting in the dark, watching a light that showed them nothing. This next story is different in nature from the previous two. It is not supernatural, which in many ways makes it worse. A woman named Priya submitted this account. She is now in her mid-30s, and this incident occurred when she was 19. A college freshman attending a movie with her roommate in a large urban multiplex. She describes it as the night that permanently changed the way she moves through the world. The film was a popular action movie. A Friday night showing. The theater was packed. Priya and her roommate, a girl named Justine, arrived a few minutes after the trailers started and had to take whatever seats were available. They ended up in the very back row, the last row in the house against the back wall. They were seated near the center of the row. To Priya's right, Justine. To Priya's left, an empty seat, and then a man sitting at the far left end of the row, near the aisle. Priya noticed him when she sat down. 30s, she guessed, nondescript clothing. He was alone. He wasn't looking at her. She didn't think anything of it. The movie began. About 15 minutes in, Priya became aware that the man had moved. He was no longer at the far end of the row. He was now 2 seats to her left. She glanced at him. He wasn't looking at her. She turned back to the screen. Maybe he'd moved for a better view. It happened. 10 minutes later. One seat to her left. Priya felt the first real pulse of alarm. She leaned toward Justine and whispered that the man next to her kept moving closer. Justine glanced over, saw the man, and agreed it was weird, but suggested they just switch seats, move further to the right. They shifted 2 seats to the right. The man did not move. Good. For a while, nothing happened. Priya started to relax. Maybe she'd misread it. Maybe he'd just been uncomfortable. Then Justine gripped her arm. Hard. Priya turned. The man was now in the seat directly behind them. He was leaning forward. He was smiling. Priya later told us, and I want to read her exact words here, because they are important. She said, "It wasn't an aggressive smile. It was patient. Like he had done this before and he knew how it ended and he was not worried at all." The girls got up immediately. They went to the lobby and found a staff member, a young man who looked barely 18, and told him what was happening. The staffer went into the auditorium, came back a minute later and said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description in the back row. Priya insisted. She and Justine went back in with the staffer. The man was gone from the back row, but when they returned to their original seats to collect their things, their jackets, their bags, their drinks, they found something on Priya's seat, a single folded piece of paper. She opened it. Written in neat, careful handwriting were 2 things: her name and her home address, not her college address, her parents' home address, where she had grown up, in a different city. Information that was not publicly available. Information she had not given to anyone at school yet. Priya began shaking so badly that Justine had to hold her up. They called the police. Officers came. The man was never found. The theater security footage showed him entering alone, paying cash at the box office, but the camera angle at the exit only captured his back, never his face. The case was never closed. Priya never went back to that theater. She moved to a different dormitory the following semester and spent months looking over her shoulder every time she went anywhere after dark. She told us something that has stayed with me since I first read her submission. She said, "The scariest thing was the patience. Whoever that man was, he had taken his time finding out who I was before he ever sat down next to me. The theater wasn't where it started. The theater was just where he decided to let me know. We don't know who that man was. We don't know what he intended. We only know that somewhere out there, a very patient, very deliberate person followed a 19-year-old girl to a movie theater and wanted her to know that he knew exactly where she lived. If anything in Priya's story sounds familiar to something that has happened to you, please report it to your local law enforcement immediately. This behavior does not stop on its own." Our 4th story comes from Marcus. He is a former maintenance worker at an independent cinema in the United Kingdom, and he worked there for 11 years before the venue closed. He describes the cinema as an old converted theater, originally a Victorian-era music hall that had been adapted for film in the 1950s. The kind of building with history layered so deep into its bones that you could almost feel it when you walked through the door. Marcus loved that building. He told us it was the best job he ever had, until the last year when something changed. The cinema had 6 screens. That was documented. That was official. 6 screens, numbered 1 through 6, each corresponding to a former section of the original music hall structure. The programs, the tickets, the staff directories, all of it referenced 6 screens. And yet, there was a door. Marcus first noticed it in his 3rd year of working at the cinema. It was at the end of a maintenance corridor on the building's lower level, a part of the building that dated back to the original Victorian construction. The corridor was used primarily for accessing electrical panels and storage. Marcus walked through it regularly. The door was old, heavier than the other doors in that corridor. Dark wood, with a tarnished brass handle and a small placard mounted at eye level. The placard read, Screen 7. Marcus assumed it was a leftover from some old plan. Perhaps the building had once been intended to have a seventh screen that was never completed. He didn't think much of it. He tried the handle. Locked. He moved on. For years, that was the extent of it. The door was just there. Locked. Labeled. A curiosity and nothing more. New staff members would occasionally ask about it, and the senior employees would shrug and say no one knew exactly what was behind it. Probably just a disused storage room. In his 10th year, Marcus began to notice something new. The door was not always locked. At first he thought he was imagining it. He'd walk past and the handle would turn slightly or seem to, and then he'd grip it properly and it would be locked. He told himself his hands were playing tricks on him. But it happened again, and again, until one evening in November, working a late shift alone, he walked down that maintenance corridor and found the door to screen 7 standing open, not ajar. Open. Wide open. The darkness behind it was complete. Marcus pulled out his work flashlight, a powerful torch he carried for inspecting electrical spaces, and shone it through the doorway. What he described to us next took him several paragraphs to write. He said he rewrote it 4 times because he kept doubting his own memory. What the flashlight showed him was a room, a large room, much larger than should have been possible given the building's layout. Marcus had worked in that building for 10 years and knew its floor plan well enough that he was certain no room of that size could exist where this one appeared to. The room was set up like an auditorium, rows of seats, old seats, the kind with red velvet upholstery that matched the decor of the original music hall. Not modern cinema seats, vintage ones, dozens of them, arranged in curved rows facing a screen at the far end of the room. The screen was showing something. Marcus could not make out what it was from the doorway. The image was moving, he was certain of that, but the colors were wrong. Too dark, too slow, like watching something underwater or like a film running at the wrong speed. He did not go in. He told us, and he was very direct about this, that every instinct he had was screaming at him not to step through that door. He described it as a physical feeling, like standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. He backed away. He walked to the end of the corridor. He turned around. The door was closed. He reported it to the cinema's general manager the next morning. The manager, a no-nonsense woman who had run the building for 20 years, went pale when Marcus described the room. She did not say it was impossible. She said, "Don't go near that door again. And don't tell anyone else what you saw." Marcus pressed her. What was it? What was in there? She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "We don't know. We've never known. But the last person who went inside didn't come back out." Marcus worked his final year at that cinema without ever going near the lower maintenance corridor again. When the building closed, he asked the manager one more time about the door. She told him the ownership had known about Screen 7 for decades, that every few years someone would find the door open, that no one had ever found a rational explanation for the size of the room, for the vintage seats, or for what the screen appeared to be showing, and that the staff member who had entered years before Marcus worked there had simply never been seen again. No sign of them inside, no sign of them outside. The case had been reported to police, filed as a missing persons report. Never solved. The building has since been sold and partially demolished as part of a renovation project. Marcus told us he checks the news sometimes, hoping, or maybe dreading, that someone doing construction work might find something behind that wall. So far, nothing. This story was submitted anonymously. The submitter, who we will call Caleb, as they requested, attended the opening night of a major blockbuster film at a large multiplex in a major American city. The year was 2012. The theater was sold out. Every seat in the house was filled. I want you to hold on to that detail. Every seat in the house was filled. Caleb arrived with a group of 3 friends. They were excited. This was one of the most anticipated films of the year, and they'd purchased tickets weeks in advance. They settled into their seats in a crowded, buzzing, energetic auditorium and waited for the show to begin. The theater was the kind of place that took opening night seriously. There were staff members stationed at the doors, checking tickets carefully. The lights dimmed. The trailers ran. The audience cheered at familiar franchise logos. It was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of communal movie experience that reminds you why going to the cinema matters. Caleb was happy, right up until the moment the film started and the man in front of him turned around, just to look at him. Caleb described the man as being in his 50s, heavyset, wearing a baseball cap. Nothing remarkable. He turned around, looked at Caleb directly, held eye contact for a moment, and then turned back to face the screen. It was odd, but not alarming. Maybe Caleb had accidentally kicked the man's seat. He leaned forward and quietly apologized, just in case. The man said nothing, didn't react, just sat there watching the film. 20 minutes later, the man turned around again. Same thing. Direct eye contact. No expression. No words. Then back to the screen. Caleb's friend Damien, sitting to his left, noticed it too. They exchanged a look. Caleb shrugged. Damien looked uncomfortable. 30 minutes after that, the man turned around again. But this time he did not look at Caleb. He looked at the empty seat next to Caleb. Caleb's other 2 friends were seated to his right, both present and accounted for. The seat to his immediate left, between him and Damien, was not empty. A woman had been sitting there for the entire film. Caleb had barely noticed her. She'd been quiet and still, watching the movie, minding her own business. But when the man in front looked at the seat to Caleb's left, the seat was empty. Caleb looked left. The woman was gone. He hadn't felt her get up, hadn't heard the seat fold up. Damien, on the other side of where she'd been sitting, was looking at the empty seat with an expression of total confusion. Caleb turned back to the man in front of him. The man was facing forward again, but his shoulders were shaking. Caleb realized, slowly, with a cold creeping certainty, that the man was laughing. He tapped Damien. They both got up and went to the lobby. Caleb told a manager that a woman who had been sitting next to him had disappeared and that the man in the row in front was behaving strangely. The manager took this seriously. A sold-out auditorium with assigned seating, a woman unaccounted for. They pulled up the ticketing records. The seat to Caleb's left, the seat where the woman had been sitting, had not been sold. It had not been sold, which meant it should have been empty the entire evening, which meant the woman Caleb and Damien both clearly remembered sitting there, quietly, peacefully watching the film for the better part of an hour, had never had a ticket, and the man in front, according to the ticket records and the staff who had checked tickets at the door, seat in front of Caleb was assigned to a woman, a young woman, who had checked in at the door. The man in the baseball cap, the man who had turned around 3 times to look at them, who had laughed with shaking shoulders, who had somehow known before Caleb did that the woman beside him was gone, was not supposed to be sitting there. The manager and 2 staff went into the auditorium to locate the man. He was not in his seat. They searched the theater, the restrooms, the lobby, the parking garage. No man in a baseball cap. The woman to whom the seat actually belonged was found in the lobby. She said she'd left the auditorium about 40 minutes into the film because a man had sat down in her assigned seat and refused to move when she asked him to. She'd been too uncomfortable to push the issue. She described the man as being in his 50s, heavyset, wearing a baseball cap. No one ever identified him. No one ever identified the woman who sat silently in the unseated seat beside Caleb for an hour before vanishing without a sound. Caleb told us he still thinks about the man's shaking shoulders. Whatever was funny to him, Caleb wrote, I don't think I want to know what it was. This story comes from a woman named Sandra, who was in her late 40s when this happened. She is a retired school administrator and describes herself as a logical, practical person who does not believe in the paranormal, or didn't, until the evening she is about to describe. Sandra went to the movies alone on a Saturday afternoon. A matinee showing of a drama she'd been looking forward to. The cinema was a mid-sized independent theater in her town, the kind of place with one main screen and a few smaller rooms. She had been going there for 20 years. She knew the staff by sight if not by name. It was her neighborhood theater, and she felt completely at home there. She took her usual seat, 4th row from the back, center, and waited for the film to begin. The usher who showed her to her seat was a young woman she didn't recognize. New hire, she assumed. The young woman had a flashlight and wore the theater's standard uniform. Dark trousers, a wine-red vest, a small name badge that Sandra couldn't quite read in the dim light. She pointed Sandra to her row, smiled politely, and moved off. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. The film was about an hour in when Sandra realized she needed to use the restroom. She slipped out into the aisle, made her way to the lobby, used the facilities, and on her way back was stopped by the theater's manager. A man she knew by face after 20 years. He asked her if she was enjoying the film. She said yes. They exchanged a few pleasant words. And then Sandra mentioned, just in passing, just making conversation, that she'd noticed the theater had taken on new staff, as there had been an unfamiliar usher working the main screen. The manager looked puzzled. He told her there was no usher assigned to the main screen that afternoon. It was a quiet matinee showing and they were running with minimal staff. Just him and one person at the concessions counter. Sandra frowned. She described the young woman in detail, the uniform, the flashlight, the name badge. The manager's expression did something complicated. He excused himself for a moment and made a phone call. When he came back, his tone was measured and careful. He asked Sandra very specifically, had the usher said anything to her? Done anything unusual? Sandra said no. She'd just shown her to her seat. He nodded slowly. Then he told her something that Sandra says she has never been able to fully explain. The description Sandra had given, the young woman's age, her appearance, the specific way she'd smiled and gestured to the row matched, almost exactly, an usher who had worked at the cinema 12 years earlier. A young woman named Claire who had been a part-time employee while attending the local college. Claire had died in a road accident during her 2nd year of employment. She had died on a Saturday, during a matinee shift. The manager said that over the years, 3 other longtime patrons had described being shown to their seats by a young woman in uniform who was not on any staff roster. All 3 descriptions matched. Same age. Same approximate appearance. Same polite smile. Same small movement with the flashlight. The manager, a practical man, Sandra told us, someone who had been dismissive of such accounts when he first started at the theater, said that by this point in his tenure, he had simply accepted it as one of the things about the building that he could not explain. Claire loved this place, he told Sandra. She worked here for 2 years and she took it very seriously. I think she just never really stopped. Sandra went back into the auditorium and finished the film. She looked for the usher. The aisle was empty, but she told us that as she was leaving at the end, as she filed out through the lobby with the rest of the small afternoon audience, she glanced back at the screen, at the empty auditorium going dark, and in the back row, almost invisible in the dimming light, she thought she saw someone sitting there, alone, just watching, even though the screen had already gone black. I want to be careful about how I present this next account because it involves a crime, a serious one, and because elements of it were independently verified by law enforcement. Some details have been changed at the request of the person who submitted it, but the core of what happened has been confirmed. The submitter is a man we will call Thomas. He is in his early 40s and works in a technical field. He asked that we be vague about the location and time frame. What I can tell you is that this happened at a small, independently owned cinema, the kind that still runs older films alongside new releases, that hosts special screenings and film festivals, that prides itself on curating unusual or overlooked cinema. Thomas was a regular patron. He attended a special screening of a restored classic horror film, the kind of one-night event that these independent cinemas are known for. The theater was mostly full, maybe 60 or 70 people. The crowd was enthusiastic. Film lovers, horror aficionados, people who came for the experience of seeing something old and rare on a proper screen. The film began. For the first 20 minutes, it was exactly what the audience expected. The restored classic, complete with occasional imperfections that gave it that authentic analog character. Grain, scratches, small jumps in the edit. All of it charming. All of it part of the appeal. Then the film changed. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. It happened so gradually that Thomas told us he wasn't immediately sure he was seeing something different. The footage began to shift. The visual style became less polished. The quality dropped slightly. The narrative, if you could call it that, stopped following the story of the classic film. Thomas described what appeared on screen next carefully and with considerable reluctance. He told us he has never discussed it with anyone other than law enforcement. What appeared to be spliced into the film was footage of a real location, a real building, shot in what looked like natural light, handheld, without sound. Interior spaces, empty rooms, corridor, a staircase, and a door. At first, Thomas thought it might be some kind of artistic insert. Some directors embed experimental sequences, and this was that kind of screening with that kind of audience. He assumed it was intentional. Then the camera moved through the door, and Thomas realized he recognized the room on the other side. He recognized it because he had been in it before. It was a room in his own home. He recognized the wallpaper, the shape of the window, a specific piece of furniture that had belonged to his grandmother. Details that could not be coincidence. Someone had filmed the interior of his house and spliced that footage into the film playing on the screen. Thomas stood up. He was barely processing what he was seeing. Around him, the rest of the audience sat watching. He heard murmurs, confused reactions, people assuming it was an intentional artistic choice. Then the footage showed his front door. From the outside, and a hand reaching for the handle, Thomas left the auditorium. He called the police from the lobby. Officers arrived. The film was stopped mid-screening. The projectionist, a young man who had been hired specifically for this special event, was questioned at length. He told police he had been given the film reel by the event organizer that afternoon, sealed and labeled, and had played it without previewing it in full, which was standard practice for restored prints. The event organizer, when contacted, said the reel had been supplied by the distributor. The distributor said they had sent only the official restored print. The reel recovered from the projection booth was examined. The footage of the classic film was genuine. The splice, nearly 4 minutes of footage showing Thomas's home, was found embedded in the middle of the reel, physically spliced in, by hand, on physical film. Someone had obtained a copy of the reel, physically cut it open, inserted 4 minutes of footage shot inside Thomas's home, and resealed it before it reached the cinema. The footage of Thomas's home was dated, based on forensic analysis of the film stock and the content visible in the frames, to approximately 3 weeks before the screening, meaning someone had been inside his home 3 weeks earlier, and had wanted him to know. Thomas underwent a full security review of his home. No evidence of forced entry was ever found. No fingerprints. No forensic trace. The case remains open. He has since moved, changed his address, reduced his public-facing presence significantly. He told us he thinks about the audience sometimes, the 60 or 70 film lovers who sat in that dark theater and watched footage of the inside of his home and thought it was art. No one got up, he said. No one thought anything was wrong. I was sitting in a room full of people watching my house on the screen, and I was the only one who knew what I was seeing. He has not been back to any movie theater since. Our final story for tonight is the one that has stayed with me the longest. I have read it many times since it was submitted. I have tried to find holes in it. I have tried to rationalize it. I have tried to find the explanation that makes it ordinary. I have not found one. This account was submitted by a woman named Helen. She is in her 60s and lives in a rural area of the American South. She is a retired nurse, and she writes with the precise, careful attention to detail that her profession required. She submitted her account with documentation, photographs, a local newspaper clipping, and a hand-drawn diagram of the theater she is about to describe. We have reviewed all of it. The theater in question was called the Lakeview. It was a small, single-screen cinema in a small town. The kind of town where the movie theater is also the community center, the place where everyone gathers, the heartbeat of the social calendar. Helen grew up going to the Lakeview. Her parents took her there as a child. She took her own children there. She knew every creak in the floor, every spring in every seat. The Lakeview closed in 1987. Economic pressures, the rise of home video, the usual story. The building sat empty for many years afterward. And then, when Helen was in her 50s, she heard that it was being renovated. Private investors were restoring it, planning to reopen it as a boutique cinema and event space. Helen was overjoyed. She volunteered to help with the restoration effort. She spent several weekends working on the building, cleaning, cataloging, helping with the documentation of the original fixtures and decor. She felt, she told us, like she was reclaiming something precious, like she was part of giving the old place a second life. One evening in late October, she was working alone in the auditorium after the other volunteers had left, cataloging the original seats, which were in remarkable condition given the decades of disuse. The building had no power yet. She was working by flashlight and the fading natural light from the fire exits. She was in the middle of the auditorium when she became aware that the building had gone very quiet. Not just quiet, still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it. The kind you notice because it's different from ordinary silence. She turned on her flashlight and stood up from where she'd been kneeling. The auditorium was full. She saw them gradually, as her eyes adjusted and her flashlight swept the room. People in the seats. Rows and rows of people sitting quietly, facing the screen. Dozens of them. The auditorium was nearly at capacity. Helen did not scream. She told us this herself. She was surprised by her own reaction or lack of one. She said it was because of the feeling in the room. Not threatening, not cold, familiar. She recognized some of them. She said this plainly, without drama, the way a nurse might record an observation in a chart. She recognized some of the people in those seats. Her parents, neighbors from her childhood, people she had sat in that very auditorium with as a young girl. People who were now dead. They were not looking at her. They were looking at the screen. The blank, dark, powerless screen. Helen stood in the aisle for what she estimates was about 3 minutes. She did not feel afraid. She felt, in her words, like she had walked in on something private, something that was not meant for her, but that she was being permitted to witness without consequence, as long as she remained still and quiet and respectful. So she stood still. and she was quiet, and she watched the people in the seats watch a screen that showed nothing. After 3 minutes, or what felt like 3 minutes, the flashlight in her hand flickered once, and when it steadied, the auditorium was empty. Helen completed her cataloging work, packed up her things, and left the building. She has never told this story to anyone in her community. She was concerned about how it might be received, but she wrote it down in careful detail and kept it. And when she found our channel, she decided it was time to share it. She said she doesn't think what she saw was frightening. She thinks the Lakeview's old patrons simply never quite left. That perhaps, in the way that a place can hold the echo of what happened there, the way certain rooms smell of the people who lived in them long after they're gone, the Lakeview had held something of everyone who ever loved it, and that maybe, in the dark, when no one was watching, they came back to sit in their seats and watch movies that only they could see. The Lakeview never reopened. The restoration project ran out of funding and collapsed. The building was eventually demolished in 2019 to make way for a parking structure. Helen says she drove past the empty lot once. After the demolition, she said it felt like the town had lost something it didn't know how to name. Those people in the seats, she wrote, I think they had to go somewhere else. I just hope they found another dark room and another screen, wherever they went. 8 stories, 8 movie theaters, 8 accounts from real people who sat down in the dark to watch a film and found themselves instead in the middle of something they still cannot explain. I think about what it is about movie theaters that makes them such fertile ground for the strange and the disturbing. Maybe it's the darkness. We willingly blind ourselves when we enter those rooms. We sit in the dark with strangers and we agree, collectively, to direct our attention toward a light. We lower our defenses. We allow ourselves to feel, or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the fact that movie theaters are places where we go to see things that aren't really there. Images projected onto a flat surface, stories told in light and shadow, emotions manufactured by people we will never meet. We go to movie theaters to see things that aren't real. And sometimes, perhaps, the things that aren't real decide to look back. Thank you for spending this evening with the Scary Collector. If you have your own story, something that happened in a dark room, in a theater, in a place where you were supposed to be safe and something made you uncertain of that safety, we want to hear from you. Our submission links are in the description below. Every story on this channel is a real story. Every voice matters. Stay safe out there. Keep the lights on. And if you go to the movies this week, check the seat next to you before the lights go down. This has been the Scary Collector. We'll see you in the dark. Before you go, if this video kept you up at night, you are not alone, and honestly, that means we did our job. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new story from the Scary Collector. We upload new content every week, and trust us, there is so much more where this came from. Drop a comment below and tell us which of tonight's 8 stories disturbed you the most. We read every single one, and if you want to keep the fear going right now, the playlist in the corner has more true stories waiting for you. Good night, sleep well, and remember, the scariest stories are always the ones that actually happened.